This is Nanaya Boa. I am coming to you live from Brantford, Ontario. And Dawn, my beautiful guest today, is coming to you live from New York, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Tuscarora Reservation in Lewiston, New York.
Okay. Tuscarora Reservation in New York, not the one in Brantford, which I thought you were in Brantford, but it's like, wow, you're not here at the moment. So, we're going to have a beautiful conversation, and I am really excited. First of all, let me say a big thank you for saying yes to this interview. I've been looking forward to it for a while now. After I spoke to your publisher, January, Marie Rogers, yes. And it was a blessing for me to meet her and for her to point me in your direction. And this book, Memory Keeper. So before we start this interview, I'd like to know a little bit about you, Dawn Cheryl Hill. Who are you?
I am having a real hard time hearing you because it's the connection is very choppy. Do I sound okay?
Yes, you do.
Okay. All right. So you want to know a little bit about me? Okay. I grew up here at Tuscarora in Lewiston, New York, Tuscarora Reservation, which is where my father is from.
Okay.
I worked my whole social work career in the Buffalo area, Buffalo, New York. And then I retired about 5 years ago and I moved back to what I call home, Six Nations in
Mhm.
Brantford, Ontario. Six Nations of the Grand River. That's where my mother is from. That's where my membership is. So I've been there about 5 years, and currently I am working as a social worker in the Six Nations Family Health Team as a
Okay.
psychotherapist.
Okay. All
Hmm.
right.
Yes.
Okay. Now, um,
Hmm.
in reading your book, a lot of things jumped up at me. Where did I put this note? A lot of things jumped up at me. But you know what? Before I go into those things, number one, I want to ask why the title Memory Keeper?
I think it's because, you know, a lot of things triggered memories for me. And sometimes, like, my siblings would say, how can you even remember that? I don't
Mhm.
remember that at all. And so I guess that's where it comes from, is that sometimes stories would come to me because, something triggered those stories in my mind, whether it was a dream, whether it was a smell, whether I saw somebody who reminded me of, an incident, something. And that's when those memories would come out, and I would have to write them down.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Ah,
And
so the,
one
the
thing about this, go
I'm
ahead.
listening.
I was going to say one thing about this book is that I never, thought about making a book. What I did was every morning I would write a story, whatever story that came to me, and
Mhm.
then I would send it by email to my sisters. So if I didn't send them a story by noon, they'd say, "Where's my story?" And it was always, something that got triggered, and that's how this book came about. It's just a story, a memoir. It's all these little stories that came to me that I shared with my sisters.
Beautiful. It's very powerful. It's powerful. Um, so I think the follow-up question will be, at what point did you decide to put them all together as this book?
I really think that is something that I would credit to Seti Aguiso, meaning creator, he who made me. Because what happened was I went to Chiefswood for a
Yes.
dinner and poetry reading, and the poetess just happened to be January Marie Rogers, who was there. So we had dinner. She read her poetry. We took a tour of Chiefswood, which is the
Yeah.
homestead of E. Pauline Johnson, a very well known poetess. So afterwards, after, talking with her and walking out to the car to her, I just mentioned, in passing that I write. I love to write.
Mhm.
She said, "Really? Well, I just happen to be a publisher looking for indigenous writers." I said, "Well,
Yes.
I just write for me, for my family. I really just write to straighten out my head, just to
Yeah.
get these thoughts out and get them on paper. And then I'm centered, grounded, and I feel
Yeah.
better. Because to me, writing is like narrative medicine. Writing is healing for me." So she said,
Therapy.
"What I would really like to," yeah, it's therapy, like art therapy, right? It's
Yeah.
writing therapy. So I said to her, no, I didn't really want to share them with her, that they were really just for my family, my sisters. She said, "I'd like to read." I said, "Okay, I'll send you three, but you know, she said, okay." So I her three stories, and in no time she was writing back that, "OMG, send me some more." And then pretty soon, "Send me everything you have." And then pretty soon it was, "I'm going to publish you." And I'm like, "Wait, no, what?" So that's how this book came about.
Well,
Not planned.
no, maybe we didn't plan it, but Icy said the creator planned it. I
I
don't know.
believe so.
Yes.
He brought us
Let-
together for that purpose.
That is right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I met your publisher at Wood, is it Woodman Woodview at the community center. I'd gone to look. I
The
was looking.
The Cultural Center.
Yes, the cultural center.
The
I
Woodman.
was looking for some
Yes.
information and I had gone there. And the purpose for which I went, I was looking for information of indigenous, Black and indigenous children, their stories, but they couldn't really help me. But in looking around, that's when I met her, and we struck it off. We
Mm-hmm.
began, sister soul to soul conversations, and then she left. She left, and I don't know where she went. But then I was pointed to the bookstore, Eagle's Nest, the bookstore. And when I went, she was
Good,
there again.
good minds.
Sorry.
Good minds.
Yes, Good
Do you
Minds.
mean
Good.
good minds? Good
Yes, Good.
minds. Yes.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
at Eagle's Nest. Yeah, I went and she was there again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, am I following you or you are following me? and, and so that is where
Exactly.
exactly. So that's where I found that she's an author. And it's like, I gotta have your book. And it's like, I'm a publisher too. So she had come for copies of your books from there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, I need one too. I need one. When I
Yes.
began to read it, th- for me, this reading was a bit different from other forms of reading. Maybe because I knew the places you pointed to, some of the places you pointed to. So it was emotionally difficult for me to hear some of the narratives. Now, I will stop talking. It's not about me, it's about you and this journey. So, one of the themes you talk about in this book is forgiveness. How is forgiveness important to you?
To me, I think that forgiveness is not about really forgiving that other person for whatever it is, harm that they have created. Um, I think forgiveness is for yourself, right?
Mhm.
I don't think that you need to hold on to angry, hard, harsh feelings because that person is going on and living their life and not even realizing that you're holding all of this against them. So for
Mhm.
me, forgiveness is about just letting it go, realizing that you can't change that person, that maybe they'll never take responsibility or for what they've done, ownership. So there's no point in to being mad about it. Just let it go. Forgiveness, I think, is for yourself, not necessarily for that person.
Okay. All right.
Mhm.
So somewhere in the forward of this book, I underlined how do we call it? A portion. So as you said, you help us with our mental health for the most part. That's what you do, and you write that in page on page 10. You write that it was my lack of wellness that made it crystal clear how important self-care was to my mental health. What
Mhm.
was going
Yeah.
on at that point?
Um, well, at that point exactly in time, the reason why I was writing was I did have, I don't know what I want to call it, a kerfluffle, a dust up, a little, situation with
Mhm.
my previous workplace.
Mm.
And I would name it lateral oppression. I
Ah,
would name it aggressions that
questions,
were
yeah.
happening to me
Mm-hmm.
because I was in a different territory that was not one that I was a member of.
Mm-hmm.
And I was getting a lot of pushback from my colleagues at that
Yeah.
time. And so I just finally realized that, you know what? I need to take care of me.
Mm-hmm.
And staying on that job was not taking care of me. And so I walked off the job. And this writing, that's really when I began writing a lot, writing every day, was a way for me to work through all of that lateral oppression. That to me, lateral oppression is that we as indigenous people,
Mm-hmm.
people of color, we have been oppressed all of our life. We have been subject to prejudice
Yeah.
based on our phenotypical, you know, attributes and,
Yeah.
and labeled as less than by the dominant culture. And then we learned that lesson so well that we then began to laterally oppress those who are on the same level,
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And so that is where a lot of my writing came from, trying to figure that out and understand why. And that's my understanding of why this happened to me. Mhm.
Okay. Beautiful. It's I think many of the themes you touch on, many Black people also have had similar experiences, so it's very well understood and very well appreciated. And the fact that you wrote this book is also very well appreciated because it's not only an indigenous voice here in Canada, but it's an indigenous voices around the world, and including blacks and oppressed people. So it's, you thought you were writing for you, but Dawn, you wrote for all of us. Yes, you wrote for all of us.
I
And,
agree. Yes, yes.
and that one of the questions I wanted to ask was that why this telling was important. And in your opinion, will you encourage indigenous people to, more indigenous men, women, children to, write their stories or tell their stories, whichever form that they do write or tell it in?
Oh, absolutely. I would really encourage anyone out there to write. to just sit down and write whatever is in your mind. Give yourself maybe 10 or 15 or 5 minutes a day to just sit down and write whatever. I call it a brain dump. Just let it out because that helps you to become much more centered and grounded. And
Mm-hmm.
this fall, I will actually be doing a 10-week writing class
Okay.
for 10 participants. I'm already working on that. And it is about, writing as medicine. I
Yes.
just finished a writing course that was through the University of Toronto, and that's exactly what it was. The the facilitator was a social worker with the
Mm-hmm.
same degree I have, and all
Yeah.
the participants were doctors or nurse practitioners or physician's assistants, people who are, workers,
Yeah.
and they are utilizing writing as a way to deal with the trauma that they encounter on a daily basis. It was a wonderful writing experience for me. So
Yeah.
one that I can take and help others on, my territory at Six
Beautiful.
Nations.
Beautiful. And they need it because otherwise you get a lot of them cranky, and I don't even want to go there. You meet cranky nurses, doctors, and nurse practitioners, and you haven't done anything to them, but they are cranky because they've absorbed all this negativity and it's festering in them. So,
Mhm.
in your book, you talk about, okay, so one part of the book that really caught my attention, and you just, touched on it a wee bit, is that your father's people are Tuscarora in New York, and your mother's people are here, Six Nations here. And so it's a matrilineal system. You still go
Yes.
by the
Okay. So
matrilineal
here,
system.
say that again. I still go back and forth. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I was asking is if the indigenous people are still going by the matrilineal system.
Okay. All right. So here in New York State, yes. Here in
Mhm,
the US, yes, it's still matrilineal. For all of those nations that have always been matrilineal, that is how you get your membership is through your mother, because you
mhm.
always know who your mother is.
Yes.
But in Canada, the Canadian government changed it to patrilineal. I want to say because they were colonizers and the patriarchy and all of that. I'm not going to go deep into that, but to me that was absolutely the wrong thing to do because that is not the way that we as First Nation people, we gave our clans, we get our clans from our mothers.
Hmm.
So for when the Canadian government did this and changed everything to the men as the person that you get your membership in a nation, your community, it really messed things up. Like for traditionally, a lot of people don't know. Like even myself, like I was always told that I was a Mohawk of the Turtle Clan, the
Hmm.
Nyagehaga. Mm-hmm. Is it Anola? Niwagi the Loden, like I am of the Turtle Clan. But
Yes.
now I have done more research, and other people too are telling me that no, as a matter of fact, you are an Adaga of the Bear Clan because when this Canadian government changed things around, it really messed everything up.
Hmm.
So but yet, my mother is enrolled at Six Nations as a Cayuga Upper Cayuga because that's what her father was. But her
Hmm.
mother was always either Mohawk or Onondaga. So yeah, I'm still trying to sort that out. But yeah, it
Wow.
has really kind of messed with our matrilineal, our lineage, our clans, everything.
It has. It has. The reason why it perked
Mhm.
my interest also is that I come from the Akan in Ghana, and they also, many of us are matrilineal. So many of us are matrilineal, but because of colonization, it became more of a patriarchal country or community. So it's interesting. The more I dig into, or the more I get exposed to indigenous history and stories and everything, the more similarities I find with, I'll say I'm an indigene of a different, continent, but the more similarities I also find in our narratives. So,
Yes.
so you're going to read excerpts for us. So I think
Yes.
it is about time we hear some excerpts from Memory Keeper.
Okay. I'm going to read the first chapter. The
Okay.
first chapter is called Disassociation.
Mm-hmm.
And this chapter um, is about a time in my life where I was, um, off to college. I came home from college
Mm-hmm.
to interview my mother because I wanted to know more about her time at the Mush Hole, which was also
Mm-hmm.
called the Mohawk Institute and is now called the Woodland Cultural Center in
Yes.
Brantford, Ontario.
Yes.
So I'm going to read this.
Okay.
My mom and I sat across from each other at the table on an unseasonably warm Indian summer day in 1979. The dining room table sat at the far end of the living room. Behind the table was an oversized mahogany buffet that was chock full of my mother's beads and beadwork in various stages of completion. In the corner of the room was her matching mahogany curved glass china cabinet that held all her treasures. Our dining room table was so old it probably could have qualified as an antique. It was a rectangular table with carved, spindly barley twist legs that were joined by a cross stretcher underneath that probably gave it enough strength and stability to remain standing after a family of 15 had gathered around it for hundreds of meals. It had a whitened scorch mark on the top where someone set down a hot pan. On one side of the table was a bench that my father had engineered many years before I was even born. It was made of 2x4s with some type of rough hewn planks nailed on top with an apron on each side. At one time it was painted John Deere green, but you could barely see that, as the wooden paint had been worn smooth and shiny by all the children seated upon it over the years. None of the chairs matched, and whatever fabric upholstery that once covered the seat of my chair was long gone. I could feel something crinkly underneath my leg as I sat there in my jeans and Oxford button down shirt. I was home for the weekend from Keuka College, an all girls college in the Finger Lakes region of New York. I was working on a paper about trauma, and I wanted to ask my mother all about her experiences when she was in the mush hole as a child. At that time, I wasn't aware of the official name it went by, the Mohawk Institute. I only knew that everyone called it the Mush Hole. I had my pen in hand and a notebook ready to fill with all my mother's reminiscence about her time as a child interned there with her two sisters. She never spoke of it, so I wasn't sure which two sisters were at the mush hole with her. It was probably about 10:30 on a Saturday morning. My mom had been up for a while and was sitting at the table beading. Her long salt and pepper hair was braided and pinned up behind her head. That morning it was a little unruly and wisp of it stood up around her face. My mom was once a beauty, but after birthing and raising 10 children and living a life full of hard knocks, she looked older than her 54 years. She had on a orange paisley patterned house dress and a pair of brown polyester pants underneath it. I'm sure her sister, Mary Penny, had made the pants for her. The moo might have been a creation of my Auntie Pen, too. My mom, Hazel Leona Van Every Hill, was born on the Six Nations Reservation in Oswego, Ontario in 1925. She was the eldest of 10 children born to Titus Venevri and Vera Beulah Thomas. My mum shared the same dark complexion of her father, as well as his rather prominent proboscis. Her grandpatine nose was passed on to my sister Dolores and brothers David and Ty, and maybe me, so they say. I can imagine myself practically dancing down those stairs because I wanted to get a jump on this paper. I wanted to get it outlined, drafted, and hopefully ready to type up once I got back to Cuca. I sat down across from her, set my paper and pen down, and I started to explain that I had just completed a paper on the Jewish Holocaust for my diversity and oppression class, and I mentioned how I wanted to write about her experiences at residential school. I wanted to compare and contrast her experiences with cultural and linguistic genocide to that of straight up genocide that the Jewish people experienced in Nazi Germany. I especially wanted to know how she and her sisters ended up at the mush hole, how long they stayed there, what she learned, what happened, what it was like. I began with a simple question of, how old were you when you went there? At that moment, my mom changed before my eyes. She disappeared. Her eyes went blank, and it seemed like she suddenly had, or maybe always had, nictating eyelids. Somehow, I never noticed that before. It looked like this other membrane has unexpectedly slipped across her eyes, and she no longer saw me or the room we sat in. I could imperceptibly hear a loud clang, like a gate was slamming shut around her. I continued to talk and I kept asking questions, but she had morphed with faraway eyes from the Rolling Stones song. I couldn't reach her anymore. It hit me like a sledgehammer. I was seeing someone dissociate. However, it wasn't someone in the midst of a therapy session. It was my mom. This was way too real and frightening. I thought it was all my fault. What I was studying at college, in textbooks about psychopathology, psychological pathology, had somehow led to this chicken coming home to roost. She was definitely disconnected from her thoughts and possibly her own identity in that moment. I had always believed my professor when she said that the mind is a very powerful thing. In that moment, it was giving my mom a way out. She had shut down, opted out, emotionally detached. I felt the cold hand of fear on the back of my neck, and panic began to rise in me. My biggest fear was that I may not get her back. I called her name, Ma, Mom, Mommy, but my voice didn't register anywhere within her. I put my hand on her shoulder and she flinched and pulled away. Louder, I said, Ma, Mama, can you hear me? Slowly, she relaxed a little and she blinked. Her eyes changed and she seemed to regain some focus. She looked at me, but she didn't say anything. I said her name again and I asked her if she was okay. It was taking her a little bit longer to process my question. I didn't want to trigger any more unpleasant or hurtful memories for her. She finally said she was okay, and then she picked up her beading needle and she continued to bead the edging on the barrette she was working on. There was no more to say. All the questions I had were gone, left unanswered. Whatever conversation we might have had was never to be. My concern for her emotional well being far overshadowed my desire for answers in that moment. It has been over 40 years since I attempted to expose my mother's tenuous connection to the memories from her childhood. I never tried to dredge up her recollections again. Over time, a thought occurred to me. In her silence, was she protecting herself or was she protecting me?
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow. That is deep. It's different
Hmm.
hearing you read it and me read it.
Uh huh.
Yes, yes. That is deep.
Hmm.
And the answer at
Yeah.
the question at the end, was she protecting herself or was she
Or was
protecting?
she protecting me?
What do you
And I
think?
gotta say that I was at a meeting, and there were some survivors there,
Hmm.
and their children would ask them questions too that they just weren't able to answer their children. And what they said at that time was, what happened to me was so hurtful, and I'm still not healed from it. So why would I want to lay that on my children?
It's okay. Okay. So it's like it's carved over, there's still a wood infested underneath. If they pry it open, they have to deal with all these hurts right back from the start. And um, sometimes the difficulty of dealing with that, it's rather, I don't want to talk about it and move along than going back to the roots of
Hmm.
it. And uh, listen, every
Yeah.
time I pass
To
by,
go.
every time I go there, I just shake my head.
Hmm. Hmm.
I just
When
shake
I
my
go there, when I go to the Woodland Cultural Center and I get out of my car and my feet touch the ground there, instantly my insides they start to quiver.
Yeah, yes.
Hmm. Yeah.
It, it's like there's a heaviness of spirit in
Hmm.
the place,
Yeah.
and unhappy, spirits, and it it weighs down. It does weigh down. But then that is just me. That is just that is just what I get from being in that space.
Mm.
Yeah. But who
Yes.
knows?
Hmm.
That is why we are here
Yeah.
today,
Hmm.
to talk about
Yeah.
this, to let their stories be known, that it is not too far off in history. It so before I even go into that, maybe you give us some whatever history you know about, settlers and indigenous people, just a brief history from what you know about it, especially amongst your people in New York.
Uh-huh. A brief history of what? Because I missed that piece.
A brief
Oh.
history of indigenous people or the Tuscarora that you know in the US.
Okay. All right. Well, the Tuscaroras originally came from down in North Carolina. They resided around Lumberton, Red Springs, down in that area, like kind of the center of North
Yep.
Carolina. And um, I do know because I lived there in Red Springs for 6 months, and I
Hmm.
met a lot of people there who told me they were Tuscarora.
Okay.
But I also have to say that most of them, there was a lot of intermarriage with Black people there
Yes.
in North Carolina because they looked at me and they said, "You're not Tuscarora," because my hair was, straight. They all had very curly hair. And they
Mm,
said that I was not Tuscarora. And I said, "Yeah, I am." So I know that there was a lot of intermarriage.
mhm.
And I heard a story not too long ago that there was a man who was at a hospital in down there. I don't know whether it was Lumberton or in that area.
Mhm.
And they were in a hospital. I don't know why they were there. And they heard somebody speaking perfect Tuscarora. And I know that I have an article from, I want to say, the Toronto Sun or somewhere from 1986. I still have
Mhm.
this article. I was actually going to use that in one of my writing classes that I'm doing as a theme to write about. And it said in this article that the last Tuscarora speaker has died back in 1986. But this was not too long ago. This person told me they were at this hospital down in North Carolina and they heard somebody speaking Tuscarora. So they went to investigate and they found this man in this bed, in this hospital bed, and he was black and he was speaking perfect Tuscarora, and he said he was Tuscarora. So I know there was a lot of intermarriage. So I'm not sure the year. I want to say 1600s. It could be 17. The Tuscaroras were kind of chased out of that area, and they all fled north,
Yeah.
and they ended up here in this area, Lewiston,
Mhm.
Sanborn, New York, and this was the land, the territories of the Seneca.
Yeah.
Seneca is another part of the Six Nations Confederacy. So
Mhm.
if you look at like New York State as your hand, so the
Yeah.
Senecas, they were called keepers of the Western Door, and then
Okay.
you had the Cayuga. They were called the people of the Muckimuck lands, and in the
Okay.
center of New York, you have the Onondagas, and
Yes.
that's they keep the central fire. And then after that is the Oneidas. They're
Yes.
called people of the Stand Rock, and then the Mohawks. So those were the five original nations of this confederacy.
Mhm.
And then Tuscaroras, when they came up to this New York state to, flee murder, being murdered, they were
Genocide.
adopted into the Confederacy. And
Mhm.
that's why we have six nations and not five anymore.
Okay.
And so this land that I'm sitting on today is originally Seneca territory, but now
Mhm.
it's the Tuscarora Reservation, thanks to the generosity of the Senecas.
Wow.
Mhm.
Wow. The I think the person that set me on the path of indigenous storytelling was Thomas Kin, The Truth About Stories, his Massey lecture.
Mhm.
And that was the first book I read in grad school in education. My particular focus is counter storytelling, counter storytelling,
Mm-mm.
and
Mhm.
yes. And when I read that book, my whole I was writing, but the whole intention of the writing and the speaking changed 360 degrees because
Wow.
yes,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
especially the one in his story that I use is the creation story, indigenous creation story, the woman as the center, and
Mhm.
then collectively it's done, versus
Yes.
the creation story in the Bible, the patriarch who decides what needs to be done. And then if you don't follow this, whatnot, these rules, you are banished from, yes. So the judgment, the harshness of the judgment versus the collectiveness of the society or community makes a huge difference how we perceive the world that we live in. Since since that
Mhm.
moment, they say that the rest is history. My intentions
Yes.
of doing
Hmm.
interviews such as these are not just to for us to have a conversation, but to change the narrative which you've written, the narrative of indigenous people in Canada and what we've been fed in the media about indigenous people, the images we've been fed, which is similar to Africa. The images fed of Africa is hungry children, yada yada. The images fed of indigenous people to those of us immigrants in this country is, drinking and lazy and all those. But the history, the history
Yeah.
is always omitted. And it's my intention that we dig through this history, we dig into it.
Yes.
And the
Mhm.
reservations are not just reservations. To me, it's equated as if there's a third world, then this is sort of the fourth world, in the sense that you are within the land of your ancestors and your power has been stripped from you. Apartheid South Africa, and this is what I always say, is
Mhm.
even, you know, gone. But indigenous people still live on the land of on their ancestral lands. And every day it's a struggle to be, but you rooted here before we
Yes.
came.
Yes.
You rooted here before we came.
Mhm.
Now, let's
Yes.
take it on the
Mhm.
high note. Mrs. Mickey's laundromat. If enough is enough, what do we do?
Yes. Okay. Let's read Mrs. Mickey's Laundromat because to me, that is a story about when you finally have had enough, when enough is enough
Yes.
and you can't take it a moment more.
Yes.
Mrs. Mickey's Laundromat. It was a beautiful Saturday morning in the summer of 1977 when I heard my mother yelling up the stairs for me to get up. I reluctantly got out of bed. It was already stifling in my room, and I didn't relish the thought of going to the laundromat that morning. Mom told everyone to bring their dirty clothes downstairs, and as dutiful, obedient children, we all did. The clothes were all dumped unceremoniously onto the middle of the living room floor. We then started sorting them into various piles of whites, colors, and darks. And when we finished sorting, we had 13 baskets full. The boys then loaded them into the truck of our mother's extremely large pink Buick Electra, with the overflow filling up the back seat. I was not looking forward to an afternoon stuck in a hot and muggy laundromat, washing, folding, and resorting tons of laundry. As the youngest girl, this was one weekly chore that was relegated to me. My mother would have a racing form, a newspaper, and a cold bottle of pop while she sat in the waiting area for me to complete the assigned task. I never felt slighted or put upon because my elder sisters all had to do this task at one time, and now it was my turn. It didn't mean I loved the job, just that I knew it was a job that had to be done, especially if I wanted clean clothes to wear. That was some radical acceptance on my part. Mom and I got into the car and she started driving down Dog Street, which was the nickname for the road we lived on our res. It was called Dog Street because of the inordinate number of dogs that ran around loose, wild, and free each day, just as I yearned to do that summer morning. We headed up into the city towards our destination, Mrs. Mickey's Laundromat on Military Road, a place I abhorred because of Mrs. Mickey herself. She was probably in her late 60s and would invariably have on her short all occasion miniskirt, a tube top, a matted blonde wig, and bright red lipstick smudged on in the general vicinity of her lips. She tried mightily to beautify herself. All of her pale and wrinkly skin was on display for all the world to see. Mrs. Mickey would speak so condescendingly to my mom with some derogatory comment about those dirty Indians. Worse yet, Mrs. Mickey would say something about someone my mom knew, and she knew everyone from the res. Earl, who was Mrs. Mickey's maintenance man, but more like a boy toy, was always limping around the periphery. He seemed to enjoy eyeing all the getch and assorted foundation wear as I loaded them into the washing machines. He stank of piss and old cigars. He had a club foot, a cauliflower ear, and was always chomping on a nasty cigar butt. He had Herman Munster boots, with one sole an inch thick and the other at least 4 inches thicker. I would always go and stand next to my mother whenever he approached me and tried to mumble something to me. On this particular summer morning, my mom was not in the mood for any of Mrs. Mickey's racist shit. We got there and I carried in all 13 baskets and I started to load up the extra large washers that held 2 to 3 loads each. I started up the first few washers and then my mom went to the counter to ask Mrs. Mickey for some change so we could start the rest. She seemed to be taking longer than usual, so I walked towards her to find out why. Then the yelling started. Apparently, Mrs. Mickey had accused my mom of using slugs in her washing machines. That did not sit well with my mother, who was never one to filter her thoughts, nor did she resist unleashing her meat hooks if she determined it was necessary in any given situation. My mom's thick arm flew across the counter with a right hook that would rival Muhammad Ali's. Mrs. Mickey's matted wig went flying off her head, and the fight was on. My mom threw down the gloves as she proceeded to let Mrs. Mickey have it. The worst memory from that day was Mrs. Mickey in a headlock under my mom's bingo wing being pummeled. Her tube top was down around her waist, and her boobs were hanging to her knees. With each right hook, her whole body shook and her boobs would sway in unison. If only I had a sharp stick to erase that memory from my eyes. Shortly thereafter, the police were on the scene. The final outcome was that we had to leave, and my mom was banned from Mrs. Mickey's for life. I remember pulling the clothes out of the machines and the water dripping all over the linoleum floor. I had to haul out the now heavier baskets of soaking wet clothes to the car. We then drove to Pearson 18th Street to another laundromat, and I had to go through the whole process in reverse. By the time we got home with the laundry all washed, folded, and sorted, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, from all the shenanigans I had witnessed that day. I wondered afterwards about her reaction to Mrs. Mickey, how she seemed to have reached a breaking point. My mom was keenly aware of how the laundress spoke about other Indians from the res. There was some radical acceptance going on in her mind. She didn't like it, she didn't condone it, but she had to accept it if we were to get our laundry done for the upcoming week. It was only when Mrs. Mickey accused Mom of being a thieving Indian, a roustabout, and a roughneck did she finally retaliate with the violence that she had grown accustomed to using to protect herself. As embarrassed as I was for the scene she had caused, I couldn't hold anything against her. At first, I blamed it all on my mom, but in retrospect, it seems she could take only so much of the systemic racism and microaggressions that were directed at her for her entire life. I was secretly glad that Mrs. Mickey finally got her comeuppance when she was manhandled by Hazel.
I feel like I'm being bad
Mhm.
and urging this on, but enough is
Say
enough.
that again.
I said, I feel like I'm
Yes.
being bad, urging this on, but enough is enough. And
Hmm.
this is something that I can clearly identify with, and many many I don't have to tell you. So, for those who don't know, many Black and Indigenous people go through these microaggressive behaviors and, discriminatory discrimination almost all the time, whether people are consciously doing it or subconsciously doing it. We go through it all the time, and it is not nice. It is not nice. So everybody has a
Mm.
breaking point, and this I understand. This I understand. You write so
Yes.
beautiful. Your writing is so
Thank
beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing these necessary stories. But there's one story, one part in particular that is very dear to my heart, and that is institutional racism. From your story,
you.
it occurred in the hospital. Do you care to elaborate a little bit on it? I think we have a time.
Okay, I will read that one. Um, this story is about my brother David. Um, he, I have to say that I love my brother. He was in the Air Force. He was, well, maybe I'll just read it, and it just explains how I no longer have my brother here because he was not afforded the medical care that most people would have been afforded if they were not indigenous. He was left without any medical care because the nurses and doctors assumed that he was just a drunken Indian, probably out the night before, throwing up because he was probably hungover, but that wasn't the case. My sister tried to tell them that he had high blood pressure. That was what the problem was, but they did nothing. Even though on all the doors there was all these signs and symptoms about high blood pressure, and every one of them he met, and yet they did nothing for him. So I will read institutionalized racism.
Yeah.
It's kind of heartbreaking.
It, it,
Okay, I should have went and got my box of Kleenex. Okay,
I,
we'll be
I'm
good.
so sorry. I didn't mean this part, but it's
I
something that
will.
I have come across quite a bit. That's why I wanted you to read it, and then we can discuss. We can go more to it after you're done.
Okay, I'm going to read it. Here we go.
Thank you.
I called. Okay, I called my sister because I couldn't sleep. I was lying in my bed trying hard, but sleep eluded me. In flashes and bits, my mind kept reliving another traumatic day. It was Saturday, March 20th, 1999. I had gotten up early and I left the house to go out and get some groceries before the kids woke up. I took my time and was relishing some me time, even if it was only wandering through Walmart to stock up on household necessities, then stopping to drop off a coat that needed cleaning, and finally stopping at movie time to pick up a couple DVDs to watch that night, one movie for the kids and one for us. By the time I arrived home that day, it was the afternoon. My husband said, "You need to call Peg," my sister Denise, right away. I had a cell phone from work, but I had left it at home as I slipped out to get my weekend errands done. I wish now that I had taken it. I called Peg and she answered right away and said that she was at the emergency room with our older brother David and that I needed to get there immediately. My heart began to beat faster because of the fear I heard in the undertone of her voice. I didn't stay to put the groceries away or even get a chance to watch the movies that night. They had all been intended for entertainment and relaxation that weekend. All was forgotten as the anxiety, fear, pain, and grief took over my life that day, overshadowing all other thoughts of parenting, cooking, cleaning, work, or any other of the other everyday tasks that usually filled my weekend and life. Driving to the hospital in my Dodge Caravan, my mind was focused on David Craig Hill, only 43 years old. He had recently moved back home after living in Tacoma, Washington for about 16 years. He had been stationed there while serving in the U.S. Air Force, where he met his wife Sonia. He then joined the Tacoma police force after his tour of duty was over. He was a sharpshooter while in the Air Force and had traveled extensively to compete in tournaments around the globe. My mom had saved clippings from the newspaper that he had sent her that documented the many trophies he had won with his eagle eye. He was talented artistically too. He could do anything: fix a car, carve a totem pole, remodel a whole house, play lacrosse, hunt, fish, draw beautiful creations, and shoot a bow. Anything that he set his mind to, he accomplished. I thought of his son Dustin, who at 19 years old had died less than 8 months earlier. He had tried to wrestle a gun away from his friend so he wouldn't shoot someone else, and in the process, he lost his life trying to protect others. We had all experienced so much pain and loss that we had not yet completely processed. Now what? Nothing could possibly be wrong with Dave because he was strong. He seemed invincible. He took care of himself. He jogged, he exercised, and was in good shape. I thought maybe he cut himself at work and needed stitches, or maybe he fell while working and broke something and needed a cast. My mind wouldn't let me think past those possibilities, no matter what Peg said. She was a nurse, and I was sure that she was overreacting. Worst case scenario thinking. She must have misunderstood what the health professionals were saying, and there was nothing to worry about. Or more plausible, I misunderstood what she was saying to me. It was easier for my mind to deny that could be anything serious or life threatening. Once I got to the hospital, my emotional defense mechanisms failed me miserably because there was no denying that he was gravely ill. I have no medical background. I couldn't comprehend the gravity of the situation like Peg did. Walking into the ER and seeing him lying on the gurney tore at my heart. It made my stomach ache and I felt dizzy instantly. His forehead was deeply furrowed with lines that indicated to me that he was in a great amount of pain. His eyes were always bright and glinted when he smiled and laughed, but now they were dulled with dark circles around them. It was hard to understand what he was saying to me. There was no liveliness, no light-hearted bantering back and forth. That was usually part of our greeting to one another. He was suffering severely. It was obvious to me just looking at him. I wanted someone to come in there, post haste, and fix him, relieve his suffering. It was about 1:30 p.m. and Peg was the only family member there with him. David had been brought into the Niagara Falls Memorial Medical Center by a rural metro ambulance. He had been vomiting en route and still had the bucket the EMTs had given him during the ride to the hospital. Peg was providing the only care he seemed to be receiving while in the emergency room. Peg went to the nurse's station numerous times to first inform them and then to reiterate that David had chronic hypertension and they needed to do something to reduce his blood pressure. Nothing was done by the medical staff except to give him compazine to reduce his vomiting. Peg stated that Dave was losing his ability to speak and swallow. She was cleansing his mouth with large lemon flavored cotton swabs. She was down to the last one and she asked me to go to the nurse's station and ask for additional swabs, which I did. Upon returning Upon reaching the desk, I stood there for a couple of minutes, and neither the nurse nor the doctor sitting there made any attempt to acknowledge me standing in front of them. I finally voiced my request for additional swabs. I held up the empty package so they would know what I needed. No one made any movements to get up and respond to my request for assistance. Instead, a middle aged nurse finally looked up and said, "We don't have any more of those," and turned away from me and went back to her documenting. I walked back to Peg and I told her what had transpired. I think that was her tipping point. She was scared, exasperated, and frustrated at the lack of standard level of medical care being provided for our brother. She stood up and I got out of her way. She had reached the end of her rope, and I saw the rage in her eyes. She didn't have anything to say to me, but I knew that she was raging at the lack of concern, which was beyond disrespect. It was equivalent to disregard or depersonalization, negligence for David's well being. I wasn't aware of it then, but Dave had begged her, "Don't let me die," right before I had arrived. It seemed there was nothing she could do to get anyone's attention, to realize the severity of his medical condition. By this time, it was almost 6 p.m., and David had been in the ER for 7 hours. Peg stormed the nursing station. She was beyond angry, and the tone and the volume of her voice made sure the doctor and the nurses knew it. She related to them again all the symptoms that she was observing in our brother, displayed on almost every door with a poster about strokes. It wasn't the fast posters they have now. It listed symptoms of headache, visual disturbances, floaters, blind spots, loss of speech, and vomiting. And he had all those warning signs, and she told them she believed he was having a stroke. The doctor on call said to her, "Do you know what a stroke is?" She responded, "Yes, I do." The doc then just stated, "Well, I've been studying for over 8 years and I don't even know what a stroke is." The word furious couldn't even begin to describe what Peg was feeling in that moment. It was more like helplessness or hopelessness because no one was listening to her or acknowledging her fears. She came back without any lemon swabs. A nurse followed her into the cubicle to examine David. She saw for herself that he couldn't swallow. His speech was incomprehensible. I think he had already slipped into a coma. The rest of the medical staff then rushed into the area and began shouting orders and told us to leave and go to the waiting area. David's fiancee, Tara, and most of our siblings had arrived. As we were walking back to the waiting room, a voice on the intercom said, "Doctor Quick, to the ER, Doctor Quick, ER." Peg dropped to the floor next to me, sobbing. She repeated, "He's dead, he's dead." I had no idea what this code meant, or no idea that this code meant all staff were needed as the patient was in imminent danger of dying. Instead, I was embarrassed and I tried to get Peg up by pulling on her arm, saying, "He's all right. He's going to be all right. Get up." Peg just said again, "He's dead," as she let me help her back up. Tears welled up in my eyes at the sight of the pain on her face. That same nurse came into the waiting room and took us to another waiting room that was somewhere deeper inside the hospital. It seemed we walked through a maze to get to it. She told us the doctor was coming to talk to us. We waited for about 20 minutes, and the same doctor who had been so condescending and dismissive to Peg came back to talk to us. He said things like, "Oh, he's so clean for an alcoholic. Oh, he has such good musculature for an alcoholic. And he has such good dental work for an alcoholic." I stopped him and I said, "Who told you that my brother was an alcoholic?" He replied, I think one of the nurses." And I said, "No. We told those nurses that he was a police officer, a sharpshooter, not an alcoholic." I said that he does smoke, and the doctor, in a very contemptuous tone, said, "Smokes what?" Like he expected me to say marijuana. Instead, I said Marlboro Reds. At this point, the doctor continued on with all his medical jargon, mumbo jumbo, for quite a while. I shut down emotionally. I could hear his voice, but I couldn't comprehend anything he said. It didn't matter then, did it? It was too late, wasn't it? My brother, my hero, my mom's favorite son, was for all intents and purposes already dead. He had slipped into a coma from which he never awoke. He was dead because in their racist minds he was nothing but some drunken Indian who had wandered into the ER, probably after a night of heavy drinking, and was throwing up. An inconvenience. What the hell were they supposed to do about it? They disregarded everything Peg said to them because of their institutionalized racism. He was just another drunken Indian, not worthy of any heroic measures to save his life. David was on life support for 5 days. He had no brain activity. That same nurse came and asked us for his organs. Fuck no. Fuck you. We were told he had suffered a cerebral vascular accident, a CVA, a stroke. I didn't think it was an accident. I think it could have been prevented if they had this and provided an acceptable standard of medical care to my beloved brother. Weeks later, I picked up the coroner's report, and he said that he had never seen anything like it before. David's brain was like foam, maybe due to the hypertension. All I knew was that my brother suffered, and they did nothing to ease his suffering. They should have been held accountable. They weren't. Our family met with a lawyer. We felt that something had to be done to address the substandard care that David was provided in the emergency room. One of the first things the lawyer did was to dispatch a letter requesting all the medical records from that day and all subsequent care during his hospitalization. We waited months before we received a response. And when the lawyer got the records, the doctor's notes had been doctored. They were bogus. They said that he had walked in on his own when he was transported via ambulance. They listed many procedures that hadn't ever happened. The lawyer said that we couldn't move forward based on the information that they had sent him. I wrote a letter to the CEO of the hospital outlining what had happened that day. He called me and we talked. The main thing I wanted him to be aware of was the systemic racism and inhumane treatment my brother suffered at the hands of his staff. We discussed cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, cultural dissonance, and institutionalized racism. He agreed to allow me to come into the hospital to do a cultural sensitivity training session. I stated I wanted that nurse and the doctor to be in attendance. She was, he wasn't. She sat in the front row, arms crossed. She wouldn't look me in the eye. I could tell she wasn't actively listening to me. She seemed too hardened to even attempt to engage in a discussion. My only hope is that medical staff wouldn't continue to view all indigenous people through that racist lens as alcoholic, lazy, dirty, living high on hog on that casino money. I don't think they internalized any of the information I was trying to transmit to them. I have heard multiple stories since then of other indigenous people presenting at their ER and being treated with disrespect and spoken to despairingly. Nothing changes if nothing changes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's
I made it through it and I didn't turn into a Jeet Louisa crybaby.
no,
I
it,
think
it
that in writing all stories down, it cuts that emotional tether to those feelings. And so I can look at it as history, things that have happened in my life, and it doesn't go zoom back to that moment. And I don't lose my emotional regulation and start
yeah.
crying and blathering because I've processed it all in writing it.
But you know what I want to do, especially this portion, share it with my fellow nurses working in healthcare. And this is a personal story. I had the privilege of, taking care of somebody, a lady who is also indigenous. and we were having a
Mhm.
discussion about the healthcare system. And exactly what you narrated is exactly similar. I wouldn't say exactly a similar story to her experience. And let me use a phrase, she didn't want to rock the boat, quote unquote, because she didn't want to be a complainer and everything. So she didn't want to rock the boat, and just sat and just looked at things go on. And I quite remember, before this was the time I was doing visiting nursing here in Brantford. Before I had gone, you ask, nurses have stories about clients, and I heard a story about her. And with me, my thing is, let me do my own assessment, because I have a different way with people. And when we sat and like we having this conversation, the conversation unearthed so much, which for the most nurses, they wouldn't listen. What is the history? Why does she not want us in her space? If you understand where she's coming from, you can give her the care. But I really wanted you to touch this one, because it's something that many immigrants, Black people, indigenous people deal with. And it's many indigenous people deal with because Black nurses like myself also misconstrue what the larger narrative has been told. He came in drunk, he's vomiting. So we're not looking at the human being presented in front of us. What is his story? We're not looking at the big clinical picture. We're going by hearsay. But what is the
But he
person?
wasn't drunk.
But he wasn't drunk. And that's what I say.
He
Here's,
wasn't drunk.
at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, Dawn, whether the person was drunk or not. It is a human being, God's creation, the universe, part of the universe, the creator, that has come to seek help. And in my
Yeah.
books, it's as simple as to do unto others as you would like others to do unto you. So it doesn't matter. All the excuses and stories doesn't matter. A person comes in black, white, Chinese, blue, green. They come in seeking help. How do I
Mhm.
best give you that help? It's simple. That is my books.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, my sister, it's that part is deep, and I hope many of the healthcare professionals will have also the opportunity to listen to this part. If they can't listen to the whole story, at least listen to this part and have a better understanding. And also that when we reach out, whether in the hospital or in public health or wherever we reach out to work with indigenous people, we accord them that respect given to every human being. It is necessary. My dear, we have
Mhm.
gone past our 1 hour.
Oh, okay.
Wow. This Your book is
Mhm.
powerful. So first, tell us, if people are looking to get some copies, where can they get copies from?
They can get copies at Cole's Bookstore in Brantford. They can get copies at Earcrafts. They can. I have copies if they just want to email me, or they can get copies from um, goodminds.com, or
Good
they
man.
can get copies from the publisher who is
Mhm.
ojistopublishing.com, OJISTOH
Yes.
publishing.com.
Yes.
Or they
Beautiful.
can email me,
Yes.
Dawn C. Hill 99 at yahoo.com.
Okay, okay, beautiful. When I was talking to you, the way you pronounce the all the indigenous name is like, oh, I've been butchering them like crazy. The way you pronounce, I say Cayuga. What do you say?
Cayuga is Gayakono, it's Cayuga. Mohawk
Okay.
is Ganyagehaga.
And then
Yeah.
Onienda.
Oshwegan.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, I pronounced it differently.
Mhm.
So when I heard it's like, okay, girl, you have been butchering all these names. Well done.
They are
It,
not easy to pronounce. Yes.
they're not, but I think we need to
It
learn.
was a
We all need
thank
to
you for
learn.
inviting me. It was an honor. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So
Yes.
I'll be looking forward for the next book and we'll be talking
Thank
more.
you.
And I pray that all your endeavors are successful. And I know they will be successful. Thank you and have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
All right.
You too.
Bye.
Ona. Until we meet again, Oniki.
Oh, Ona. Okay. Guys, this has
Ona.
been Nanaya
Mm-hmm.
Bua with Dawn Cheryl Hill on the Nanaya Bua Show. Thank you very much, Ona.
Ona.